We're going to go straight into it. So we're going to have Samuel up 20 minutes for his presentation.
Good evening, everyone. It's great to finally get going tonight, and I want to thank the organisers for their patience and hard effort in trying to get everything going tonight. I want to thank Ismail for coming along, and for all of you for sticking around to hear this presentation tonight. Tonight we're looking at the topic of the reliability of the Gospels. And this is an important question because the Gospels are the basis of the Christian message. Now, what are the Gospels? What does the word gospel mean? It's about the proclamation of what God has done for us in Jesus. It's the story of Jesus' life and how God was saving us through the life of Jesus. And tonight, I'm going to look at five areas briefly. I'm going to look at, are the Gospels historically reliable? Are the Gospels prophetically reliable? Do the Gospels contradict each other? And have the Gospels been changed? And what does the Quran have to say about the Gospel? So let's get straight into it. So the first point here, are the Gospels historically reliable? And I'm going to look at the normal things that historians at university would look for. So the first thing I want to say is that the Gospels are reliable because they were written by Jesus' disciples who were called by Jesus, taught by Jesus, and sent by him. And so they're eyewitnesses who are writing about him, or their companions. And so we see this here. So this is one of Jesus' disciples, that which was from the beginning, which we have heard, which we have seen with our eyes, which we have looked at, and our hands have touched. This we proclaim concerning the word of life. The life appeared, we have seen it, we testify to it, and we proclaim to you the eternal life which was with the Father and has appeared to us. So that's a real eyewitness statement, isn't it? We touched, we saw, we felt, we were there. Now, what's interesting is that this is actually not something that just comes with Jesus, but this is how the nation of Israel understood themselves. When we read in the book of Isaiah, which was before Jesus, he's a prophet a long time before Jesus, we read about this place of Israel. I, God, have revealed and saved and proclaimed. I am not some other foreign God among you. You are my witnesses, declare the Lord, that I am God. And so the nation of Israel was God's witness nation to the world. And so when Jesus calls people to himself to be witnesses, this is not a new thing. This is actually the fulfillment of what Israel had been doing before through their scriptures. Let's go on to my second point then. The Gospels are also written in the right language at the time. They're written in Greek, and Greek was the international language spoken by most Jews and people throughout that entire area. If you wanted to speak to the world, you spoke in Greek, and that's just how it was. And we see in the Gospels Jesus speaking to Greek-speaking people, and so we know that he could speak that language, and this was the international language. The Jews had already had their scriptures translated into that language. What's interesting when I look at the Quran is that the Arabic word for gospel is basara, but the Quran doesn't use that word. It uses the word Injil, which is a Greek word. The word Injil is Greek, and so we even see in the Quran this testimony to the Greek of the New Testament and of the Gospels. Did I go too far? Now, my third point for the historicity is that when we come to the Gospels, we don't just have one person telling us. We've actually got 6 different people testifying. And so there's James, the brother of Jesus, Peter, through whom we get the Gospel of Mark. There's these other sources which scholars can identify. One's called Q, one's called M, one's called L, and the other is from the Apostle Paul. But my point here is if one person tells you something, you may or may not believe it. When you get 6 different independent people telling you, the truthfulness of that goes up. And that's what we have in the gospel material. We've got multiple people telling us. Now, it's also what we find is that the information we have in the Gospels comes from the right time. What we've got here is a section from the Apostle Paul in one of his letters. Now, what's interesting with the letters of the apostles is that we can date them very accurately to within a year. And so this is a letter the Apostle Paul wrote to the church in Corinth, which he started. Now, we know quite precisely when he started this church, it was AD 50. And then he wrote the letter to them in AD 52. Now, what's interesting is that when you look at it, you'll see the underlined parts where it says, he says to them, I want to remind you of what I taught you. And he says, these are the words of Jesus. This is my body, which is for you. Do this in remembrance of me. And then again, this cup is the new covenant in my blood. Do this whenever you drink of it in remembrance of me. So what's interesting about that is that they are the exact words that we find in the Gospels. So just think about that. What we've got is the Apostle Paul just writing a letter is already quoting the precise fixed words of Jesus. And this is only within 2 decades of Jesus. It's actually about 17 years maximum after Jesus. So what we've got here in the letters are datable references to the material that we find in the Gospels. And we see this. We see that the words of Jesus are already fixed. They're fixed in exact form. They're already being used in the churches that are being planted. As new churches start, they're already getting the teaching of Jesus straight away. This is, like a decade after Jesus. They're already getting these exact words. They're being treated as scripture already because Paul's quoting them as scripture. This is what you've got to obey. And this material that we see here is exactly the same material we find in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And so what this means is that the material we see in Matthew, Mark, and Luke comes from within that first decade after Jesus. We can date it right back to then, which makes it reliable. This also is helpful for when it comes to dating the Gospels. People often give late dates for the Gospels, but we can date the material in the Gospels much earlier, much earlier. And so they're reliable in that they're coming from just 10 so years after Jesus. I now want to look at the history outside of the Bible. What I mean by that is there were people writing history around that time of Jesus. And one of them I'm going to particularly look at is a Jewish man. He's not a Christian. His name was Josephus. And we have his history. And when we read it, we actually see that he talks about John the Baptist, because John the Baptist was very well known. So this is a non-Christian writing a few decades, within the first century, but after Jesus. And he's writing about John the Baptist in the same way that the Gospels describe John the Baptist. He writes about Jesus' brother and how Jesus' brother is martyred. And then he also writes about Jesus. And so I don't have time to read all of these now, but I'll just read the one that he says about Jesus. But there was the one on John the Baptist. Here's the one on Jesus' brother. You can look up these references. Here's the one that he writes on Jesus. He says, "At this time there was a wise man who was called Jesus, and his conduct was good, and he was known to be virtuous. And many people from among the Jews and other nations became his disciples. Pilate condemned him to be crucified and to die, and those who had become his disciples did not abandon his discipleship. They reported that he appeared to them 3 days after his crucifixion and that he was alive. Accordingly, he was perhaps the Messiah, of whom the prophets have recounted wonders." Now, you see, he's not saying that he was the Messiah, but he's not a Christian. But he's just telling us what was known in Jerusalem around the year 90, okay? And that fits in with what we see in the Bible. And so what we have in the Gospels actually fits into the broader history that we know. Now, there are a few places, the Gospels give us lots of historical data and geographical data, and there's only a couple of places where we have questions. And we may not be able to fit things in easily, but there's only a few places when there's actually hundreds of references that we can log into and check. The next point I wanted to look at was archaeology. Now, archaeology is when you dig up things out of the ground. It's not written documents, it's things that you dig up. And over the centuries, people have claimed that the Gospels were wrong, that they were written centuries later, not by people who were there at the time and all that type of thing. But what has happened is that time and time again, as archaeologists have done their diggings, they've found things that have proven the Gospels to be true. So in John chapter 5, there's a particular pool, a pool of water where people would go, and people said, well, where is this pool? We don't know where this pool is. It doesn't exist. John has just invented this in the gospel. But then in 1960, when the Jews were building a highway in Israel, they actually found this pool, and it's got the number of columns and everything precisely described in John, and it had been destroyed around the year 70 AD, it would seem, and covered over. We see this with the town of Nazareth, where people said Nazareth doesn't exist. We've got no record of Nazareth. Gospel talks about Nazareth. Where's Nazareth? 2006, they discovered it. And then the synagogue in Capernaum, the Gospels speak about the synagogue in Capernaum. People said, where is one? There is none. The Bible's wrong. Then they found it. And so time and time again, the archaeologists actually prove that the Bible is true and that it fits in with the time it's supposed to. So what have I got here? The gospel fits into the time and location that the Gospels fit into the time and location that they're meant to. They're written by the right people at the right time in the right language, and there's many witnesses to them. Now, my second major point is that I want to look at, are the Gospels prophetically reliable? What I mean by that is, do they fit in with the prophets who were beforehand? Well, certainly the prophets who were beforehand said that the Messiah is coming and that he is going to bring the resurrection kingdom of God on behalf of God's people. I'm not going to give all those references, but that's the message. The Messiah is coming, he's going to bring the kingdom of God, and that kingdom is the resurrection kingdom of God. And that's what Jesus did for us. He brings the resurrection kingdom himself, but he brings it for us on our behalf. And then you can see that the themes of the gospel, the ideas of the gospel, are actually the ideas of all the earlier prophets. And so it's a reliable message in that it fits in with all the prophets. So what have we got here? We've got God created us in his image. That's in the gospel. And law of Moses, prophets, Psalms, gospel. The fatherhood and son of God. That's in the prophets before Jesus and in the gospel. Humanity is corrupted by sin. That's in the prophets before Jesus. That's in the gospel. God comes to dwell with his people. The priesthood, sacrifice and atonement for sin. So you get the idea. All of the ideas in the gospel actually have their roots and history in the earlier prophets. The gospel's new, but it's not novel. It's new, but it's not novel. So that's my first point, my second point there. My third point is, do the Gospels contradict each other? Do the Gospels contradict each other? I want to say, overall, they give the precise same story. They talk about Jesus beginning his ministry, the types of things he did, and then his death and resurrection. But they're even more specific than that. And so you can see that they will talk about John and Jesus fulfilling Isaiah 40, chapter 40. That's in all the Gospels. That Jesus died, was crucified, died and was raised. That's in all of them. That he was called the Son of God. That he was called the Son of Man. That he was called Teacher, Lord. He spoke of himself as sacrifice. He was called the Messiah and the divine Son of God. You can see that those main points, those main descriptions of Jesus are throughout all the Gospels. Now, very often there are many accusations brought against the Gospels saying, well, okay, they might have the overall picture correct and the same, but there's lots of details which are wrong. And so I'm just going to look at one of these, and then I guess I'll pick up anything that Ismail may bring up. So this is a famous man called Bart Ehrman, and he's famous for trying to show that the Bible's wrong. And this is one of his famous evidences that the Bible is wrong. So he writes, who actually went to the tomb? Was it Mary alone, as in John 20, verse 1, Mary and another Mary, as in Matthew, or Mary Magdalene, Mary and the mother of James, and Salome, as in Mark? So which one? Which Mary came to the tomb? Well, and he says it depends on which gospel you read. However, if he just read the next verse, he would see something very interesting, because notice what John chapter 20 verse 1 says. Bart Ehrman has claimed that John chapter 20 verse 1 just said it was Mary alone, but when you read the very next verse, this is what we read. So she, Mary, came running to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one Jesus loved, and said, "They have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we do not know where they have put him." And so when you actually read the next verse, you see it's not Mary alone. The Gospels are complementary. They don't give you all the details all the time. Some will just give you some details here, the other might give you another detail over there. And that's what we find, that they're actually complementary to each other. They complement each other. They might give different details at different times. They're not contradictory, they're complementary. Now, my next point was, have the Gospels been changed? Is the text of the Bible corrupted? And I want to say, no, it's not. And we've got ample evidence for this. We've got the ancient copies, we've got ancient translations, and we've got ancient quotes. And scholars have spent a lot of time looking at these, and I've given you a sample page of the Greek New Testament, where down the bottom here you can see that this is all the data from the manuscripts that we have. And so they're very careful at proving that the Gospels have been reliably passed on. And so what type of numbers are we talking about? Well, when you get the books which actually go through all the manuscripts, they tell us that there's 1,438 variants within the New Testament, which they have to, where they're saying that this different reading, it could be this reading or it could be that reading. Now, just to give you some idea of what that means, there's 1,438 variant readings. There's 138,020 words in the New Testament, so that's 1%. Trying to give you some actual numbers here. So we're talking about 1% where there might be a variant reading. Now, why is that important? Well, it's important because I don't want us to, I want us to be consistent here. If we actually compare this to the different qira'ats of the Quran, some of you may know there are these different qira'ats of the Quran, and they have variant readings between them. Now, when you look at those, scholars have written these books, and you can actually find out how many variants need to be considered. This is the two main Qurans which would be used today. When you look at them, there's 77,915 words in the Quran and 965 variants according to the Islamic scholars. So that's about 1% as well. So we both have similar number of variant readings. And what I want to say is both books have been well preserved, and we shouldn't exaggerate it. When you actually do the numbers and add it all up, we come to approximately the same number together. Now, to finish up, what does the Quran say about the gospel? Well, it's interesting. The Quran talks about the gospel as the Injil on many occasions. Let me read some verses to you. We caused Jesus, the son of Mary, to follow in their footsteps, confirming that which had been revealed before in the Torah, and we bestowed on him the gospel, in which is a guidance and light. Let the people of the gospel judge by what God has sent down in it. So you see, the gospel that's with Jesus is what Christians have, and Christians are to obey. So we're not talking about the gospel of Jesus being lost. It's actually, we've got the gospel and we're called upon to obey it. So the gospel there is seen as reliable. What about the next one? Say, O people of the book, you have no base until you observe the gospel and the Torah that has been sent down to you from your Lord. So again, the Quran's saying to Christians, you've got to obey the gospel. Again, that's saying the gospel is reliable. And here we have another verse. Those who follow the messenger, the prophet of his community, whom they will find mentioned in the Torah and the gospel in their possession. So here's this verse of the Quran, and it's saying to Christians, you're going to find Jesus in the gospel. Now again, that's assuming that the gospel is reliable. In fact, very often you'll find that Muslims will quote the New Testament to say it foretells the coming of Muhammad. Every time you quote the New Testament to say it foretells the coming of Muhammad, you're saying it's reliable, because you're saying it's a reliable source to foretell the coming of Muhammad, as this booklet does. So I need to finish up now. So what have we looked at tonight? And so I want to say, if you accept the Quran, then you've got no reasons for rejecting the gospel, because the gospel the Quran testifies that the gospel is reliable. So what have I looked at tonight? I've looked at the gospels are historically reliable. They fit into normal historical evidences for reliability. They're prophetically reliable. They agree with the prophets before them. They don't contradict each other. We've got plenty of evidence to show that they've been well preserved. And finally, the Quran testifies to the reliability of them. And my last point is, and I'm happy to give people my PowerPoint, this is a book that I would recommend if you wanted to take it further. Thank you very much.
In the name of God, the Beneficent, the Merciful, peace and blessings be upon all of His messengers without exception. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I thank you all for coming here. I thank Ryan and the guys who've made this happen. It's been a lot of work from them. And I just want to start off by saying that what we're here to do is to get to the truth, to understand each other's views better. We're not here to debunk anyone. We're not here to oppose anyone. But at the same time, we're talking about topics that we are passionate about. So certain times I may say some things that may not be too palatable. And I ask you to just forgive me for that and overlook it. It's nothing personal. I promise you about that, right? So let's get started now quickly. The reliability of the Gospels. And Samuel explained what the Gospels are. 4 biographies of Jesus attributed to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Now, why is this topic important? Because if it's true and the Gospels are reliable, then the Christians can well take their information from there and they can base their beliefs on that. But if the Gospels are not reliable, then it seems that the Christians would have to do a review and, look at things again. So that's why the topic is obviously important. Now, this whole idea of whether the Gospels are reliable or not come down to something called accepting testimony. So when someone comes and tells you something, do you necessarily accept it? So if someone is an eyewitness, if someone's not an eyewitness, he comes and tells you, my sister-in-law told me that this person's doing something bad. You wouldn't be too sure on his information because it's third-hand evidence. But if he was an eyewitness, if he was a credible person, if the information he's transmitting to you is not against what you already know. So for example, if a credible person told me, I saw your father in Johannesburg, I wouldn't really believe him because I know my father wasn't in Johannesburg in the last week if he told me that. But that can be changed also if there are multiple witnesses, 2, 3, 4 people come and tell me, then maybe I'd say, okay, maybe he went and I didn't know. But my point in these slides is just one thing, in this slide especially, is that we all have rules for when we accept information and when we reject information. It's built into every one of us, and I think we need to be consistent when we're applying these principles. And this is basically what we're going to find with the Gospels, that the Gospels are 4 biographies that reached us. We need to look at these biographies and see, okay, can we trust this evidence or can we not trust this evidence, or is there a more nuanced position than that? So we're going to discuss that. Now, I was talking about when someone comes and tells you something. But when you take in information from a book, then you need to consider 2 things. You need to consider the difference from the actual author and the events he's talking about. So did he see the events? Did he see someone who saw the events? Who's his sources? Where is he getting this information from? And at the same time, you also need to look at the manuscript that you have of his writing. So you may not have his original works, as it is with the Gospels. We don't have the original Gospels. So the manuscripts that we do have, how accurately do they portray the original of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John? So that's why there's 2 gaps, so to speak, that we need to talk about. The gap between the original events and the authors, and the gaps between the originals of the author and the manuscripts. Now, what generally happens when stories are transmitted, I think we know a lot about this, there's a memory lapse. So you probably can't even remember what you had for lunch last week, and I'm quite sure about that. But also there's misrepresentation. So we Indians like to call it adding masala to the story. So you might, just exaggerate a bit here, fudge a few facts here. It happens when you're transmitting stories. And that's why you always get 2, 3, 4 versions of the same story, and it's normal, it's natural, it happens. And the third thing that happens, and it was very common in early Christianity and early Islam, is that stories are fabricated. So we see the apocryphal works. I'm not saying all are fabricated, but there's different stories that Christians don't accept. Similarly, you see that in the Muslim tradition, there were fabricated hadith, which the muhaddithin, the people who dealt with the prophetic traditions, identified. So these are the 3 issues we're going to try to mitigate when we're accepting eyewitness testimony. Now, how do we ascertain the truth? So when it comes to Islam, there's something called the isnad method, and I'm not bringing hadith into this. What I'm doing here is I'm just showing how we generally ascertain the truth and how we decide whether testimony will be accepted or not. So, for example, why I'm using the hadith and not the Quran is because the hadith are analogous to the Gospels in the sense that the Gospels were written after Jesus, they're biographical accounts of his life. Similarly, the hadith are stories and sayings of the Prophet Muhammad. So they're quite analogous in that sense, whereas the Quran was directly revealed to Prophet Muhammad. So, for example, if you went to Prophet Muhammad in his life and you asked him to read the Quran, he could read it. But if you asked Jesus to read Matthew, he wouldn't know what it was because it wasn't yet written. So that's why I'm saying the hadith are more analogous to the Gospels in that sense. So that's why I'm using that as an example. Now, as Muslims, we believe whatever the Prophet Muhammad said about the religion is true, but we know that things can happen in transmission. So what are the 4 requisites for something to be accepted as material that we can take as a part of the religion? The first thing is that the person must name his sources. So we have books of about the Prophet written, say, a century after his life, in the end of the 1st century, beginning of the 2nd century. If that person says the Prophet did this or that, we would not accept it from him until he tells us, I heard it from this person, who heard it from this person, who heard it from the Prophet. On top of that, all of the narrators in his chain, so it's called the isnad method, meaning chain of narration, they must be people we know, they must be people who have a good memory, people who are trustworthy, and there should be no missing link in the chain, and on top of that, it should not contradict anything more reliable than that. So here's a very brief example. In the Muwatta of Imam Malik, so Malik bin Anas wrote a book. He lived at the end of the 1st century, beginning of the 2nd century, and he narrated a saying of the Prophet wherein he said, that person who misses his Asr Salah, the 3rd prayer of the day, is like the one who has lost his family and wealth. And he told us that I got it from Nafi. We know a lot about him. We have a lot of biographical data about him. Who got it from the companion Abdullah bin Umar, who got it from the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So in that sense, if a narration like that met all of the conditions, and then we would grade it as authentic. But even if it's authentic, that doesn't necessarily mean it's 100% correct, because a person could still make an error, a memory lapse. All of these things can still happen. But what's the takeaway from this? The takeaway from this is there's an acknowledgement of the problem of human error and fabrication. There's an attempt to deal with it. And most of the time, whenever it comes to any Islamic belief, it's never ever just one chain like what's here. It's generally, even this hadith on itself, this tradition has 3 separate independent chains. I've just mentioned one. And we know all of the people in all of the chains. And for something to reach a creedal point where you can accept it as part of your belief system, it has to have multiple chains till it reaches mass transmission, meaning 20, 30 chains. Then you can accept it as a creedal point. And that's the point I want to talk about now, well, before we get to this, is that reliability is of different levels. So the gospel could be reliable enough to take the broad life of Jesus from, but is it reliable to base all of your life's basically sacrifice on your religion, or is it reliable enough for that? That's what we're discussing tonight. So the second gap that we talk about is between the original author and the manuscripts that we have. So here, for example, just taking Bukhari, that's a famous book of prophetic tradition. There's over 2,000 manuscripts. The important manuscripts have a chain of transmission back to the author. Now, what about the gospel? So now we're coming to the crux of the matter and what we're really here to discuss. But why I mentioned all of that is to show you that there's already an established procedure that we Muslims have for accepting or rejecting information. And I'm not saying that Christians have to adhere to that by any standards, but it's just giving you an idea of what you'd want to do when you're accepting information. Now, generally, we mentioned the authorship is attributed to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Christians obviously believe that these people were reliable because Matthew and John are disciples of Jesus, and Mark and Luke are what we as Muslims would call tabi'een, disciples of disciples. So they believe that they were reliable transmitters. They also believe, on top of this, that these authors were divinely inspired. And this is going to be my first question to Samuel. Why do you have this belief if none of the authors said it and none of the authors claimed it? Why are you going this far to say that they are divinely inspired? Now, the first issue that we as Muslims have with the Gospels is that technically we have no idea who the author is. Yes, I know later Christians coming on like Irenaeus, etc., said that the 4 Gospels were written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, but we don't have any of the authors telling us who wrote it, neither do we have the original copy so we can back it up somehow. We just have manuscripts coming much later, and we have church tradition telling us that probably this person wrote one, probably that person wrote one, and I know there's the quote from Papias and this, and maybe Samuel and I can get into that a bit later. But technically, for all intents and purposes, the Gospel authors are not 100% known who they are. Yes, there's a church tradition, and I accept that. Even if they were known, even if we assume that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John wrote it, the gospel tells different stories from Jesus' birth right up till his crucifixion and resurrection. So who were the source for these authors? For example, even if Matthew and John were disciples, they weren't there in Jesus' life at the beginning. When the Magi basically had their conversation with Herod, they weren't there. So who's the source of information for that story? And we're going to talk about that just now. So even when it comes to dating, Samuel mentioned early dating. He said we know that because Paul is quoting them. But James Tabor and other great New Testament scholars say that they are quoting Paul and not the other way around. And the general dating of the Gospels, by most, even Christians generally accept this, is that Mark was written in about 70 AD and John is in about 100 AD. And I have quotes from Christians themselves who are admitting this, and not just liberal Christians. From what I understand, they're conservative Christians. Now, according to Hadith principles, because the Gospels authors are unknown, because their sources are unknown for a lot of the stories that are there, even if we assume that they are the authors, the sources for their stories are unknown. And one more point that I would like to mention here is sometimes, and Samuel showed this corroboration between Matthew, Mark, and Luke. That's because Matthew and Luke were directly copying from Mark. And this is a very famous issue, the synoptic problem, where Matthew and Luke directly took from Mark. I'm not saying they just used him as a source, word for word, verbatim. About 80% of Mark, if I'm not mistaken, is reproduced in Matthew, and a bit less, maybe 50% or so in Luke. So this is not independent chains of narration. We have copying taking place, Matthew and Luke taking from Mark. And that's quite clear, and we'll see some examples of that later. So because of all of these, there's no independent narrations here. We don't have the original eyewitnesses of many of the events, even if we assume the original authors. According to Hadith principles, this would be a da'if jiddan, meaning extremely weak. And again, I'm not saying Christians need to abide by that. Now, here's Bart Ehrman, and I like Samuel quoted his exact book that I'm talking about. So he says the fact that the Gospels were not written by the apostles, it doesn't make them unusual. Quite the contrary, it makes them typical. Most of the books of the New Testament go under the names of people who didn't actually write them. This has been well known among scholars for the greater part of the past century, and it's taught widely in mainline seminaries and divinity schools throughout the country. As a result, Bart Ehrman says most pastors know it as well, but for many people on the street and in the pews, he says this is news. So again, Bart Ehrman, I know he's an atheist and he's not a Christian, but he's a reliable New Testament scholar, and this, what he's saying, James Tabor and other scholars have also backed him up on this, and many other scholars as well. Now you think about this as a Christian. Who narrated the following stories? The conversation between Herod and the Magi. Can we be honest? I don't know how to pronounce that word, I'll be honest. So who narrated those stories? Who was the eyewitness for that story? Even if you could guess someone, you wouldn't be sure. The story of the shepherds at the birth of Jesus in Luke, who narrated that story? We have no idea, because even if we assume original authorship, they weren't there at the time. The events at the trial and the cross when the disciples deserted Jesus, then there was no one there to witness it. So who were they getting it from? So it's not enough to say that we have these 4 different Gospels when we know 2 of them were copying from one. Yes, John is an independent source, but at the same time, we don't know how high up it goes. It could be coming even from one person who all 4 of them are getting their information from. We don't know. I'm not saying that is the case, but I'm saying we don't know for sure. The second issue I want to talk about, and this is perhaps a very key issue that I'd like Samuel to answer, is what about the canonization of the Bible? So many Christians just assume that the New Testament was there from the time of the disciples, and it was always like that. But that wasn't the case. There were many different Gospels circulating in early Christianity. There was the Gospel of Peter, there was the Gospel of Thomas, which many people have dated quite early on, and there were many Christians who believed in these Gospels as opposed to the other 4 Gospels. So on what basis did Christians pick these 4 Gospels, or even, let's say, these 27 books of the New Testament, when there were so many other books circulating? The first time anyone on record has ever had these 27 books of the New Testament is in the year 367, from my understanding, and that is the scholar Athanasius, and it was only finally decided at the Council of Trent in the 16th century. And here again, I'm quoting Bart Ehrman, I don't have his name there. So he's talking about his experience, and he's saying he thought to himself, if God did inspire certain books in the decades after Jesus died, because there were many books written at that time, how do I know that the later church fathers chose the right book? So there were many Gospels. How do I know that the later church fathers chose the inspired ones and left out the uninspired ones? How do I know that? I could accept it on faith, he says. But then he says, but as I engaged in more historical study, I began to realize that there were lots of Christians in lots of places who fully believed that other books were to be accepted as scripture. And conversely, they rejected some of the books that are in the New Testament today. And I think this is common knowledge. He says there were some Christians who accepted the the Gospel of Peter, some who rejected the Gospel of John. He says there were some Christians who accepted a truncated, meaning a smaller version of the Gospel of Luke, and others who accepted the now non-canonical book of the Gospel of Thomas. So, and here we see we want to know, like, based on what these four Gospels make it into the Bible, was there a criteria, was there not a criteria? I think that's my second question to Samuel. And here we see Irenaeus, who was the one who really said it's going to be these four. He's saying, since there are four zones of the world in which we live, and four principal winds, while the church is scattered throughout the world, and the pillar and ground of the church is the gospel, it is fitting that she should have four pillars. So he's saying it makes sense, four zones, four winds, we should have four gospels. But he's not providing us with some sort of, logical reasoning why it's these four. So that's the second issue that we have with the gospels. Issue number 3 is that, as you can expect, 4 biographical accounts written by 4 different people, even though they were copying here and there, you're going to expect differences, you're going to expect discrepancies. This is normal. And this, I don't think any Christian should try and fight it, because any biographical data, any biographical accounts from different people do have certain discrepancies. There's no need to go out of your way to try and reconcile every single one of them. So look at the birth accounts, the genealogies, some of the stories, the passion narratives. You'll find these discrepancies, and I'm not here to list all of them, but like, when did Mary prepare the spices? Before the Sabbath, after or after? And you'll see Luke says one, Mark says another. Now you could reconcile it, you could say no, she did it both times, but these are 2 different authors who have, and they have, Luke has Mark with him, so it doesn't make sense for him to clearly go against Mark like that. And I'm not saying you can't reconcile some of these, you definitely can. But here's one that I'd like to put forward here for Samuel. Actually, it's not this one, it's the next one. Is that in Matthew, he gives a genealogy of Jesus. And he's trying to show, and Matthew's going all out to show that Jesus is the Messiah from the lineage of David. So he says that, in Jesus' lineage, you can break it up into 14, 14, 14, because 14 is equal to David in the Hebrew numeric system. So he's showing, see how amazing Jesus' lineage today, right to the top, goes 14, 14, 14. But when we compare to the Old Testament in 1 Chronicles, we see that he removed 4 of the people there. And that's how he got his 14, 14, 14. In fact, these people were actually wicked people, so maybe that's why he didn't want them in Jesus' genealogy. I'm not sure about the answer to that. And the last issue is the manuscript record. So Samuel mentioned this idea of, I'm not sure how he got that figure, and again, perhaps we're going to have to go into this, but I'm just going to quote you Origen, the church father from the 3rd century. He's saying the differences among the manuscripts have become great, either through the negligence of some copyists or through the perverse audacity of others. And if you go to to Bart Ehrman's book, Misquoting Jesus, he shows clear examples of where scribes interfered with what was in the Gospels. And he says, and Samuel can challenge this, there are more differences in the manuscript records than there are words in the New Testament. And I'm not saying that to say we should throw out the Gospels, because obviously there's so many manuscripts, you would expect something like this. But what I'm trying to say is that it's not extreme. We don't know whether the manuscripts we have today accurately represent the originals that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, who we don't know who they really are, but we're calling them that, whether it accurately represents what they wrote. So we don't have the original of any of them. We don't have a copy of the original. What we have are copies of copies of copies, and Bart Ehrman likes to say that. Now, there are very few early manuscripts. In the first 1,000 years, you can look at this that's there. In the first 1,000 years, there's only 356 manuscripts of the Gospels, most of which are actually partial copies. If you look at Mark's Gospel per chapter here, or if you look at the overall, before the 4th century, only 22% of Mark is attested to. And I'm not going to dwell too much on this, but what I'm trying to show is, in many cases, and I know John is attested much better, we are relying on later manuscripts, and later manuscripts, not all the time, but a lot of the time, have more errors in them when you're getting there. And that's why we see that the Textus Receptus, now what's the Textus Receptus? When the printing press first came out, and the Christians wanted to make a Greek model of the New Testament, the first Greek edition, what they did was, there was a rush to print the first Greek edition. So a man by the name of Desiderius Erasmus went about this, and he rushed it, and he did really a bad job. He used a late 12th century manuscript, patched it up with the Latin Vulgate. Initially, it didn't include 1 John 5:7, the only verse that explicitly mentions the Trinity, but because of the outrage of his time, he included it in there. And after he did this, even though it was such a bad representation of the actual Bible, people copied it, and they took it on, and they followed it. So for centuries after him, people followed it such that it became became the Textus Receptus. The King James Version, the second most purchased Bible in the world today, is based on the Textus Receptus. And when we look at the Textus Receptus and we see how it fares, and Samuel put a picture up there probably of the Nestle Island version, the critical editions, we see that they've removed multiple verses from the Textus Receptus, which was used for centuries by Christians. The first and obvious one is the Johannine comma, 1 John 5:7, the only verse in the Bible which had actually explicitly mentioned the Trinity. It's removed now from the NIV. The entire ending of Mark, from verse 9 to verse 20, is completely expunged. And if you look at the original Mark, it ends abruptly. The women come away and they don't tell anyone because they're scared. So scribes added on an ending. When you go to the NIV now, you see that that whole ending has been removed. The famous story of the prostitute, let he who is without sin cast the first stone, that's been removed as well. Here's some pictures from the New Testament, from the NIV, where you can clearly see that they've removed those verses. And these are just some examples. These are not one verse, two verse. These are massive stories that have an impact in how you view Jesus and his divinity. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you for that, Ismail. I guess my overall response to what you've just said there was you kept repeating, well, I'm not saying it's this, but it could be that. We just can't know. That's creating an impression that is just not true. That's just not true. And I'll come to explaining why that's the case later on. So let's answer some of the questions that you brought up. You said, where do Matthew, Mark, Luke and John say they're divinely inspired? Well, in the Gospels themselves. So in the Gospel of John, Jesus speaks about the coming of the Holy Spirit in chapters 14 to 16, and that the Spirit is going to empower them to testify to him. And so that's where it comes from. You said, how do we know what the source was for, like the shepherds and all that type of thing, and those different scenes that the disciples weren't at? Well, one of the sources is Mary. Mary was there from the word go, and we know that she's in the early church community. Also, after Jesus is resurrected, he spends 40 days, we read in Acts chapter 1, teaching through the Holy Spirit the disciples. And so I assume that that's where a lot of this comes from. Now, in terms of the Gospels being unknown, you say, well, maybe it is, maybe it's not. Well, no, we can be a lot more certain than that, because the early church, when they didn't know who an author was, they acknowledged this. So you may notice that the letter to the Hebrews does not have a name in it. And so within the early church, you can read about them and they would discuss who the author might be, but they didn't know. But you know what? They never invented a name. But yet when it comes to Matthew, Mark, Luke and John, there's the universal testimony from Papias around the year 110, then with what's his name? I've forgotten his name now. The guy around 150, and then Irenaeus. Now, Irenaeus did not invent that there's four. Irenaeus was just passing on that there is the four. So the way you presented it was, Irenaeus is the one who says this. No, Irenaeus is the one who reflects what the belief was. Now, you're saying that Matthew and Luke use Mark. Yes, of course they do, because they all come out of this apostolic witness. And as I said, there are a number of sources which are used. And this brings up one of the points you brought up, that the Gospels are not based on one person, but on a number. And so I'm looking more broadly at the New Testament now, because we've got different authors who contribute. But Mark is Matthew's own material is separate to Luke's own material in the Gospels. And people don't see them as saying the same things because they've actually got different accounts for the birth of Jesus. So they're independent sources. They're not just copying off each other. And so we have multiple accounts coming from that early group of people. And regarding whether or not Paul was copying the others or they're copying Paul, if you read in his writings and his sermons, he's actually saying that the 12 are the original witnesses, and he defers to them. The Apostle Paul deferred to the original 12. This is in Acts chapter 13, and also in Galatians, where he says, I went to Jerusalem to make sure I was not running in vain. And so he deferred to the original 12. He just didn't come in with his own thing, and his language for passing on that teaching is the rabbinic language of having received teaching and passing it on. Now, I'll move on to the questions about the canon, you said, why are there 27 books? Well, there's 27 books because there were 27 books which were seen to be authentic. They were seen to be authentic on three principles. One, that they'd been used from the beginning with the church, that the churches who had been started by the apostles could say, these are the books that we were given. And so that was one of their reasons. They had to show that it was from an apostle, that it had been used early, and that it conformed with the prophets, as I showed in that table before. Now, why were some gospels rejected? Well, it's because they were Gnostic and they came from other religions. So you can get on eBay now or Amazon and buy the gospel according to Buddhism, right? You can get those types of books where people have written them. In fact, there's the Gospel of Barnabas, which was written in the 14th or 15th century. And that's just where Muslims have written an apocryphal gospel to make an Islamic gospel. But the latest one was in 1979, and it's called The Gospel According to Islam by I think it's Ahmed Shafat. And in it, he says that he's taken the gospel and he's transformed it to make it Islamic. Now, when we see those gospels as Christians, we spot them. We don't go, oh, we're confused. We just say, no, we don't accept it. I also want to say that there's a bit of, creating a false impression here, because in the early centuries of the early decades of Islam, there were different collections of the Quran. Muhammad never collected the Quran. His companions made their own collections. There was one from Abdullah ibn Masud, Ubay ibn Ka'b, Zayd bin Thabit. They had different numbers of chapters. The chapters were arranged differently, and you can go through the Islamic literature. The verses were different with different words in them. So this is actually a question we both have. And so you can't create this impression that the canonical question is for Christians, but it's not for Muslims. It's something we both have, and we both have our ways of sorting it out. Now, you mentioned about, where is the sources for this story? And you said, the disciples fled Jesus when he was arrested, but they didn't. And so if you just read, and I'll read one of them now, when all the people who had gathered to witness, so this is, Luke 23, verses 48 to 49. When all the people who had gathered to witness this sight, the crucifixion, saw what took place, they beat their breasts and went away. But all those who knew him, including the women who had followed him from Galilee, stood at a distance watching these things. And so the claim was that Jesus, that the disciples all fled. But when you actually go and read it, they didn't flee. They were watching. You can see that again in John 19:25 and in Acts 10, verse 39. So we can't, we've got to stick to what the scriptures say. And these people were the witnesses, and there's multiple witnesses to these events. Anyway, so sorry, I'm starting to lose my voice a bit. Now, I want to make sure I've got 3 minutes. So what have we got here? The genealogy. Now, this is a really good question that he's raised, because there are two different genealogies for Jesus in Matthew and Luke. How are we to understand that? I think the first thing we're to understand is in Luke itself, it actually says Joseph was the father of Jesus, so it was thought, because Jesus, in one sense, doesn't have a genealogy. Right? He doesn't have one. He comes by a special birth. And so any genealogy that Jesus has is nothing like yours. So whenever you're thinking of genealogy and you come to Jesus, who's got that special work of God, we're in a different category for what's going to happen with the genealogy. And what we see is that these genealogies are shaped according to teaching different things, and they can actually trace out different ways because of two facts. One was you can trace it biologically, but Jesus' family being the son of David, you can also trace it politically. And by the time you bring in a political tracing of which king was after which king and which king is Jesus going to be the final, who are the kings that Jesus are in Jesus' family line, once you bring in the idea of political and biological overlapping, you bring in abdication from certain positions and also adoption, you can work these things out. And so I want to say each of those genealogies has their own unique things to show. Now, you gave that quote about Origin. I've actually written an article on that where I went through every example that Origin gives, and they're actually really small. They're actually the types of things we find in the footnotes of our Bible already listed now. So again, it's creating an impression. You quote Origin and he says, the manuscripts have got these differences. You go to Origin, he gives you the lists. I've put it in an article. They're actually really small. They're just like a word here or there. The same types of differences we get within the different qira'at of the Quran. And so again, this is something we both have. We both have variant readings. There's not just one Quran. There's 10 authorized Qurans with a whole range of variants between them. And so this is a question we both have. What have I got in my final thing? I'll just say my final points again. That, what have I got? I've got 30 seconds. Now, what will I say? You spoke about 1 John chapter 5, and we don't have the originals. We don't have original Qurans either. Like, we don't have an original complete Quran. Neither of us have originals. We've got to base ourselves on copies. And our scholars consider all what they do, and they've put their evidence out there. Bart Ehrman might say that there's thousands of differences, but as I said, the academics say, I gave you the number 1,400 and whatever, and it's 1% of variance for both our books. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks for that, Samuel. I did enjoy that, and I think at the same time, while I did enjoy it, I also kind of did predict it, because in my rebuttal, I just got a small thing to say about the Quran, because I don't think one of the strongest ways to defend what you're going to do is to refer to someone else's book. I understand what you're doing here, but I think we just need to be a little bit clear on the differences that we're talking about here. And I want to give an example, and I really don't mean I don't mean to insult anyone by this example, but just imagine you driving out of your yard with your car, and your small child's playing in the garden, and he's also playing with his toy car, and he says, see, Daddy, I have a car. And it's true, he has a car. But it's very different from your car, although we use the same words. And therefore, you're going to see what I'm going to show you now. The canonization and the so-called variants are completely different, even though we might use the same terminologies. So let's just get a few things straight about the Quran. It in itself explicitly claims to be from God. Samuel said that the Gospels say that it's from, they're inspired. They don't. They say that the disciples are inspired. That's only true if you accept that the disciples wrote it. So it's like you already claiming the point there. It has one author. It claims to be free from error. It was written down in the life of the Prophet ﷺ, who read it and taught it. It was compiled and canonized by a group of his direct companions who spent years with him. It has one stable consonantal text across all of its manuscripts besides one, and we can talk about that in the Q&A. It has a self-correcting manuscript tradition because of the preservation of memorization. 100% of the Quran is attested to in first century manuscripts, as opposed to maybe that P125 or whatever it is, that's like 1% of the Bible. It's been memorized by millions. In this room, perhaps 20 people have already memorized it. We talk about the different modes of recitation or the variants. I find it strange that we're using variants for the Bible and variants for the Quran, when the Prophet himself clearly said, "Unzil al-Qur'anu ala sab'ati ahruf kulluha kafin shafin." The Quran has been revealed in multiple modes of recitation. Every single one of them is sufficient and perfectly conveys what it needs to. Recite whichever one you want. Most of the differences that we do have there are of pronunciation. I'll give you an example of a huge change, and you can tell me how huge it is, where the one verse says that when you're going to do something, just clarify, fatabayyanu. The other verse says, fatathabbatu, just be sure. This is like one of the major examples that you're going to find. And the difference here is, the number of verses are the same. The sentence structure is the same. The consonantal skeleton is the same. The different ways of reading all come from the prophets. They're authorized from the Prophet ﷺ. They are for ease and provide a rich comprehensiveness in meaning. And some will say, okay, so that means you have multiple Qur'ans. No, it doesn't. Just as God has multiple names, doesn't mean there's multiple gods. Similarly, the Prophet taught different words, synonyms that he himself taught that you can use. Compare this now when we're going to talk about the variants in the Quran, and I call this variants can vary, because that's what's happening here. Yes, we're using the same term, but they're completely different. When we say Quranic variant readings, we mean different ways of reading that the Prophet himself taught, which are attested to with multiple chains. When we talk about variants in the New Testament, we're talking about errors or deliberate insertions made by scribes that have corrupted the text. The two couldn't be any further apart, even though, yes, okay, fine, they're both called variants. Then we talk about canonization. So here we talk about the nations of Ibn Mas'ud and Ubay bin Ka'b, and the one had 2 extra surahs, the one had 2 less. If you really look at it, a mushaf, a copy of the Quran, was not meant to be a whole compilation from beginning to end. It was meant to be what the companion needed to remember. And therefore we find that these two extra surahs that they so-called claim are actually known by every Muslim. We read in the Witr Salah, it's called Dua Qunut. He put it there because he wanted to remember it. Even if we accept these two narrations as explained by Reverend Samuel in his way, we have thousands of other companions who all agree to the Uthmanic Codex, which they heard from the Prophet, and at a time like this, one or two companions, maybe not knowing the information, reached them afterwards. That's to be expected. But compare this to the Christian version, where in the first few centuries, there's no New Testament that exists. It's just a few books here and there. Eventually in 367, we have all of these 27 books coming together. Yes, they may have existed beforehand, but there's no record of that. Still at this time, the canon is not complete. The Shepherd of Hermes and other books continue to make their way through. So again, it was not my intention to bring the Quran into this, but I know this was going to happen, and I didn't mean to insult anyone, but the truth is the truth, and we just need to stop, making false comparisons. Now, I got a few other issues here with the gospel authors. This fifth one, and it's not a bad thing, it means that I'm saying they were biased. What does that mean? They were Christians, they believed in Jesus, so they scoured the Old Testament looking for things that could apply to Jesus, and they ripped things out of context. A very, very famous example here, Matthew 1, 22 to 23, where it says that the virgin will give a birth and conceive to a son. So Matthew records Jesus' virgin birth, and then he gives this prophecy from Isaiah as though it seems as though he's making it refer to Jesus. And when we look at what happened, Isaiah lived 700 years before Jesus. King Ahaz had a problem. He went to him and told him, God is going to send you a sign. The sign is that when a young woman, not virgin as Matthew says, when a young woman comes to you, she gives birth, and before the child is big, the enemies who are troubling you will be destroyed. Nothing to do with Jesus. It came, it went, and there was really nothing there. If we look at Ellicott's commentary, it's there as a proper Christian commentary. Look at what he says. It's not so easy for us, as it seemed to St. Matthew, to trace in Isaiah's words the meaning which he assigns to them. In other words, I don't know exactly what St. Matthew is trying to get at here. If we look at other examples, Matthew says that, when Jesus was young, he came out of Egypt. So he says, this was to fulfill, out of Egypt I called my son. When we go to the actual verse in the Old Testament, we see that it's talking about Israel. It has nothing to do with Jesus. When we look at the misapplication of Zechariah 9:9, okay, I don't have too much of time for that. When we look at Matthew 2:23, it says that Jesus went to Nazareth, and that was to fulfill what was said, he shall be called a Nazarene by the prophets. But I don't think this is found anywhere in the Old Testament or the Tanakh. And the last issue is the synoptic problem, which we've already discussed, that Matthew and Luke copy from Mark. Now, we've already discussed this. There's no, whatever needs to be discussed is discussed. But my issue here is when they copy, sometimes they change. And if the gospel authors, when they copied from Mark, they made a few changes here and there, do you think that means they thought Mark was inspired or Mark was inerrant if they were going to change certain things here and there? And here we see an example of Matthew changing Mark, and it's a small one, I'm not going to go into it too much. Look at Luke changes Mark. Mark makes Jesus' last words, my God, why have you forsaken me? And Luke, he has Mark in front of him, but he makes Jesus say, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. Completely different picture. I know you can say both happened, but the point is, if he thought this was the inerrant word of God, why did he change it like this? There's many other examples like that. Another contradiction maybe for Samuel, apart from the genealogies, I'm not sure on the exact answer there, because in the genealogies, it clearly talks about this one being the son of that one. In where those 4 generations are removed, Matthew says he is the son of this person. And even for Joseph, for his fathers, it clearly says son of, father of. So it's hard to understand how you're going to, reconcile that. Then we talk about the quote from Papias. Now, Papias' quote actually proves that the Gospels are not written by who they claim by, because he says that Matthew was originally written in Hebrew. And it's a sayings gospel. But when we look at Matthew today, it's not that. He says that Mark's gospel was a whole jumbled up thing that he just recorded from Peter. When you look at the gospel of Mark, it's clearly not that. It's actually well set out. So Papias' testimony actually shows that it's not written by Matthew and Mark, because it doesn't fit the Matthew and Mark today. Or it's less likely if we're going to accept Papias. The other thing to remember is that Papias has certain sayings about Jesus that no scholars accept. He has his own version of how Judas died, and that was the last thing that I wanted Samuel to perhaps address. Or perhaps we can go to the misapplication of Zechariah 9:9, where it says that the king will come riding on a donkey and on a colt the foal of a donkey. So this is what's known as synonymous parallelism in the Hebrew Bible, and basically it's a synonym for the same thing. But when Matthew read it, and I'm just reading on the plain meaning of the text, he made Jesus come into Jerusalem riding on a donkey and a colt, because he didn't understand it was synonymous parallelism, from my understanding. And when you look at Mark, and I think one of the other Gospels, they just have only a colt there, and they don't have both of them there. But Matthew makes Jesus come riding into Jerusalem on both of those, which doesn't seem probable, doesn't seem likely, and seems to be a misapplication of Zechariah 9:9. And the last contradiction that I just want to talk about is in Matthew's account, when we look at how did Jesus die. So I'll just put it up here. In Matthew's accounts, the priests buy the field. In Acts, Judas buys the field. In Matthew's account, Judas hangs himself. In Acts, he falls headlong and bursts open. Now you could say maybe he hanged himself, and then after that the string broke, so then he fell on his head. It does seem a bit unlikely. In Matthew's account, the place is called the Field of Blood because it was purchased with blood money, and in Acts it's called the Field of Blood, seemingly because Judas's blood spilt on it. So I just got 1 minute here. I just maybe want to touch on some things here. Samuel said Paul differed to the apostles in the book of Acts, and that may be true there, but if you look at his readings, he seems to call the apostles so-called pillars. I don't need their authority, so I don't know how much he really differed to them. And if you see how he stood up to Peter and basically called him a hypocrite, I wouldn't say that was deferring to the disciples. And so I think I'll just end it off there, and thank you. I think we're going to go to Q&As now. Okay, thanks for that, guys. I know it's late, it's been a long night. You guys did 2 hours of nothing in the dark here. But anyway, so let's just conclude whatever we've discussed. It's been a lot of facts have been thrown around. And when I say that the Gospels are not reliable, again, I don't mean throw them out. There's a lot of valuable information in there. We can piece together the life of Jesus to a decent extent. The basic outline of his life, that's what I believe. That's what I've been defending here today. But at the same time, we need to just think about something, and that is that when we're putting our trust in a book, we're putting the fate of our entire hereafter in these writings. And for someone to put the fate of the entire hereafter in a writing, it's got to be a lot more than just your normal Josephus reliable. It's got to be 100% sure. It's got to be at the very least 99, 98% sure, because obviously there's a 1% that's always there. But and this is just a message to the Christians that I want to mention, that if we look at some of the errors and contradictions, we could see that there are certain discrepancies. I'm not saying they're contradicting wholesale in major things, but there are small discrepancies. If we look at the reason for canonization, we're not exactly sure why these 4 were chosen. We're not so sure, right? If we look at basically other things that I mentioned, like the fact that the gospel authors themselves changed. So Matthew and Luke changed when they quote from Mark. That means they also didn't believe that they were inerrant. If we look at the fact that when they quoted the Old Testament, they made certain errors in their quoting. They changed the translation. Maybe they were quoting from the Greek translation called the Septuagint. Whatever it is, but at the end of the day, these are not records that we're going to be calling 100% reliable, 95% reliable, or even 90% reliable. We're not going to base our entire life and our entire belief system on them, especially, and I'm emphasizing this, especially when those beliefs mark a massive break in what the entire humanity has believed, that God is one, that there's no such, that God cannot be a human, that there's no such thing as the incarnation. All of these beliefs have been there for basically millennia. And now and the Jews, someone asked me whether Muslims could consider Christians polytheists. The Jews, and I've seen Rabbi Tovaya Singh and others say that Christians are polytheists. I'm not saying I share that view. But are we really going to cartwheel ourselves basically to the edge of polytheism, the most repugnant sin, if you look at the Old Testament, based on these 4 books, and not just based on these 4 books, based on a certain interpretation of these 4 books, we're not sure who they were written by, except because Origen said something. And so are we going to really go all the way there because we think Origen met Polycarp, who met John, and therefore John 1:1? Because John 1:1 is not Jesus' words, it's John's words. And knowing who John was is important, because that verse tells you that the Word became flesh and the Word was God. If we don't know who John was, and only we're just trusting Origen here, then how can we make that massive leap to the edge of polytheism just because someone who we not sure who it is said that Jesus was the Word? So I think it's a dangerous thing. And again, I'm not well aware of your belief system as you guys are, but I'm saying just from my understanding, just from the conclusion we've drawn here today, I don't think you can reliably take that step based on what the Gospels are saying. And I think that when we look at certain, deflectives that are there, the Quran has canonization, the Quran has variants, I think when you really look into that, we didn't have time, and I'm happy to defend that in another debate, you can see that they're completely different. So don't let that be something that's an excuse that's saying, okay, we got this, but they also have that. It's completely different. Together with that, the Quran emphasizes monotheism, and that's why generally Jews believe that Muslims are going to heaven, because they're following the Noahide laws. So thank you. That's just what I'd want to say about this. Thank you very much. Good evening.
Well, thank you everyone for coming this evening. It's been a good night to engage with these ideas. I'll just give my concluding statements, which will be a bit of a summary and an engagement on some of the issues I wasn't able to engage with in the rebuttals. Tonight I've been saying that the Gospels are reliable, and I gave the historical reliability, and I looked at how they're written, that they claim to be written by eyewitnesses, and when we look at the information that comes in them, they fit into that eyewitness time. They fit into the first century. They agree historically with the other history that we have around there, and they're actually used as a historical source by the mainline universities. So the Gospels will be referenced as a historical source. I showed that they are prophetically true, and in that the prophet said that the Messiah would come and establish the resurrection kingdom on behalf of God's people, and that's what we see happen in the Gospels. I showed the big themes throughout the prophets being continued in the Gospel. Now, Ismail brought up a point here about Isaiah 7 and the virgin giving birth to a child, and how Matthew is getting it all wrong. Matthew's getting it all right, because what happens in Israel's history is used to talk about what the future will be. So there's the exodus out of Egypt. That event happens, and then is used by the prophets to talk about what will happen in the future. And so this is how we see prophecy go throughout the Bible. And so what happens in Israel's history is a sign from God for what to expect. And so the young girl and the virgin, because that's the word, having the child is picked up by Matthew, because it had its own fulfillment, but it also speaks to the future, because any sign that God gives speaks for then, but the sign also speaks to the future. Ismail said that Hosea 11 and Israel coming out of Egypt, Jesus coming out of Egypt is a misquote. No, it's not, because Jesus is the fulfillment of the nation of Israel. That's how he's presented in the Gospels. He has a miraculous birth like Israel. He goes to Egypt like Israel. The children are killed like under Pharaoh. He goes into the desert for 40 days like Israel for 40 years. Jesus is the true Israelite. And so the prophecies and discussion of Israel come to their fulfillment in Jesus. Matthew is doing perfect biblical interpretation there. You mentioned Matthew saying that Jesus was riding two animals at the same time. And so this is from Bart Ehrman. We've got this ridiculous picture of Jesus riding on two horses at the same time or something. That's not what it says. Just go and read it. It says they put their cloaks on the animals and Jesus sat on them, and just grammatically he sat on the cloaks. That's what it's talking about. He sits on the cloaks, and we just got to read that. Now what will I move down to? So we looked at the Bibles are historically reliable. They fit in with prophecy. They don't contradict each other. They complement each other. I showed you that we've got ancient copies, ancient quotes, ancient translations, and from that scholars can get down to 1%. 1%. Now, I wasn't deflecting anything when I compared this to the Quran. I was just trying to avoid false impressions that can be made. Because very often it's just, let's look at this information on the Bible and assume the Quran doesn't have those issues, and I just didn't want to have those assumptions. And my last point, which hasn't been addressed at all, is that the Quran says the gospel's reliable. It is very clear that the gospel given to Jesus is what Christians have, and it says time and time again that it is a reliable source. And so I will finish up there. Thank you very much.
The question that I have is on the credibility of Paul. Paul is a major writer of the New Testament, right? But he was a persecutor of Christians before he set up his churches. What I want to bring about here is Paul's churches literally exploded when he set them up. But the reason that they exploded was that he came onto the Gentiles and not the Jews. He set them up. Also, the Gentiles were pagans who were multi-dietary worshippers. So if you had to look at the Gentiles coming into Christianity through the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost, they're coming through what? Polytheism. Now, if you're looking at the credibility of the speaker, right, you're looking at the credibility of the writer of the New Testament, how do you qualify that as the word of God when he himself has got no credibility?
Well, I mean, I just disagree with a lot of what you said there. I'd say that Paul is credible, that the Lord Jesus chose him to do that work. This was testified to in Paul's life through the miracles. He did not compromise. When you read his writings, he does not compromise with polytheism. So in 1 Corinthians chapters 8 to 10, he's very clear to spell out our relationship with idolatry, and he basically says, don't be involved with it. So I don't see him doing it. To say that the Father, Son, Spirit is polytheism, that's the whole Trinity thing. And as I said, God is a higher order personal being, and that's what we're talking about. Now, that's not just Paul who has the Father, Son, Spirit. That's all the way through the Scriptures. Yeah, I mean, I'd have to go through the whole of Paul's life to look at his teaching, but I just basically see that Paul... Yeah, but what I mean is, I don't think you've shown that he's not credible. You're basically stating that he is, and I'm saying... Oh, sorry, okay, yes, he was... yes, well, first of all, it's established that Paul was a persecutor, yes. It's established that Paul took the gospel to the Gentiles, but so did Peter. Peter set himself up in Rome. Okay, so Peter's doing it too. But, sorry, I'm just forgetting things. Now, Jesus did say in Matthew chapter 10, do not go to the Samaritans or anyone else, but go to the lost sheep of Israel. There was a time for that. But then at the end of Matthew, he says, go into all the nations. So you've got to read the whole of the gospel. There was a time where he said just within Israel, but then he said the whole nation. So you've got to read the whole in context. That's what I'd say there. And that's what the Apostle Paul is doing. Yeah, that's what he's doing.
Thank you so much for both the speakers for coming out and giving us this opportunity. For Ismail, I just wanted to ask, I'm not too familiar, but in the Quran, does it state that Jesus was never crucified? And one of the persons that you're quoting quite a lot was Bart Ehrman, and as well as a few other atheist scholars acknowledge that if there's one thing we can agree about the life of Jesus, is that he died by Roman crucifixion. And so in using him as well, we know he denies the deity of Christ, he denies the resurrection, but just considering that you were saying that the Quran is from God, but it denies what we consider to be a historical fact.
Yeah, thanks for that. It's a really good question. And I think that's a part of the pitfalls when you quote atheist secular scholars. You've got to deal with all of their views. But I think in this case, the traditional Muslim view, which is that Jesus was not crucified but rather taken up into heaven. Again, I'm not saying the Quran explicitly states that, but that's the traditional view that has been accepted by basically all commentators of the Quran as far as I understand. It doesn't contradict, because when we say something's a historical fact, we mean the best evidences that we have at the time, the four Gospels, Josephus, none of who are eyewitnesses in the understanding of all of these secular scholars like Bart Ehrman, none of them are saying that an eyewitness saw Jesus crucified. They're saying as per historical facts go, and the historical bar is not very high before you establish something, this is something we can be fairly certain of. Now you might say, okay, the Quran says that Jesus wasn't crucified. But the Quran does say that, but it does say also that it was made to appear as though he was. So the Quran is telling you that the people at the time did think he was crucified. The Quran is not saying that the people at the time didn't know or they knew he wasn't. It's saying that they did know, that they were basically falsely led into believing this. It seemed like that to them. They passed these stories on, and these stories become historical facts. So in that sense, there's no real contradiction between the two, because the Quran is not saying that he wasn't crucified and everyone around him knew that. It's saying he wasn't, but people around him thought that he was, and that's how historical information comes about. So I hope that answers the question. Thanks.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Rafiq. This is for Reverend Samuel Green. The reliability of the Gospels, you went and you mixed it up with our Hadith. What you used, that is not the Quran. You use the Hadith and you use that. The Quran is the Bible from Allah. It was revealed to Prophet Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. And if you ever want to have anything to say from the Hadith, you go to the Quran first. The Quran is not mixed up, the Gospel is not mixed up, the Hadith is not mixed up in the Bible. It's a separate book altogether. And in the Quran, if you'll all look at it, there's the only book in the world that got the story of Mary. In Surah 19, telling you who Mary is to us. There's no Bible or anything got it. And last and not least, if you'll ever open the Quran, you'll see 136 times the name of Moses. We call Moosa alayhi salam. 25 times Jesus, we call Isa alayhi salam. And the Quran only got 5 names of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So it can't be a book from Muhammad. It's from Allah. Jazakallah.
Thank you for that. I don't think I quoted the hadith in my presentation, so I'm not sure. I'm not sure what that was, but I'll move on. I'm not sure what to say there. In terms of Moses' name, there's a surah on Mary. There is a surah in which Mary is part of that surah. It moves on to a number of other people, but she's in that surah. Yes. The Quran does talk about Moses and Jesus more than it does. It uses the name more than the name of Muhammad. However, to understand any surah of the Quran, you need to know the context of Muhammad's life. So the Quran revolves around Muhammad. You cannot understand part of the Quran without, first of all, getting the background to Muhammad's life when he said those words. And so I'd say that, while his name may not be mentioned, every surah revolves around his life. So it is, you've got to know Muhammad to understand it. You don't need to know those other people.
Thank you. Both of you have done so well putting up with the context effects of tonight and have continued laboring on. Thank you for being so gracious and giving us your time and stimulating our thinking.